I'm a historian of the 20th century United States, and I do politics and policy making. And so you might imagine that when I'm out in the general public and I introduce myself and people ask me, well, what do you do? This summer and fall, the first question they ask is, have you ever seen an election like this one? Sometimes it's phrased with sort of an expletive in there because people are sort of really frustrated trying to figure out what's going on. And I understand, and my answer inevitably is some form of no but. And what I'm getting at here is I say, no, I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this. But what we're seeing this year is not entirely surprising. And in fact, there are some sort of historical roots, historical echoes in what we're seeing this year. And if we look at the last 30 or 40 years, we can see some of these roots. And so what I'm arguing here is that this is a different election, but it also has some similarities. And this is essential to what historians think about. Historians generally, we think about change over time, right? We try to understand why and how it happens. We also have to understand continuity over time, why sometimes things sort of persist. And this is one of the things historians and my colleagues here, as you know from being in their classes, we argue about this all the time, right? One of the few things that I'm pretty certain about with this election is that historians are going to be arguing about what I'm talking about today, okay? They're going to be arguing about whether this campaign, this election, represented something new, or whether this campaign, this election, represented some sort of continuity, had some continuity with the past, or both, actually. Most historians will make the case that it's both. So my goal today is just to talk a little bit about the historical context, to give you a sense of some of the roots that are at play here. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes or so. And then we're going to open up the floor to questions and conversation. And I know from seeing so many familiar faces here that you guys have a lot to add to this conversation. One sort of point, I could be up here talking about this election and history and the roots and all that stuff for hours. There's a lot to digest, a lot to talk about. And so I don't have hours, so I'm going to be limited in the ground that I cover today. And I have to admit, there are certain aspects of this election and this election season, political season, that I struggle to contextualize historically. I'm thinking about especially some of the revelations of the last couple of weeks about sexual assaults and sexual harassment and the longer history of the Clintons, especially President Bill Clinton on some of these issues. It's actually very hard to make sense of this in a historical context, right? And this is my way of saying, like, and I think all historians would say this, we don't have all the answers yet. We haven't figured all this out yet. So I'm going to limit myself in some ways to two elements today. I want to talk a bit about Clinton and the Democrats, and a little bit about Trump and the Republicans, and then try to place their ideologies and their policies in some sort of longer continuum. That's my goal. And in many ways, I want to make a sort of contrarian case today. Because I think if, and you all are paying attention to this in the news, right, there's a lot of reporting and punditry out there that just says everything is new. This is totally different. We've never seen this before. And that's truly the case in some instances, I think. But I want to be the contrarian a little bit and argue that while this election is shocking and novel, in many important ways, it does have these strong historical precedents. Okay? So it's sort of, I'm not denying the change, the novelty of this election, but I think it's important to understand some of the longer continuities. Okay, so let's talk about the two candidates and the parties for a little bit. And I'll start with Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. Well, in some very, very, very obvious ways, Hillary Clinton represents something new in American politics, right? She's the first woman to head a presidential ticket of one of the major parties in this country. I think equally interesting and equally novel is the fact that she's the first former spouse of a president to run for the presidency. And those two things shape her candidacy, this race, and how we perceive them, how we perceive Mrs. Clinton in very sharp and important ways. Because in both cases, right, she is really breaking gender barriers, and she's challenging, I think, particular understandings of what women's roles in politics should be, and even what women's roles in society should be. And yet, I'm going to make a case right now that there is something traditional at work here. And that she's a candidate and coming from a party where we can see the roots of her origins and her emergence. So let me make two sort of points about this, make sort of two arguments. First, when it comes to gender in politics, I think there's something actually quite traditional about Hillary Clinton. She has stressed throughout the campaign, she's made, actually, I think, quite an effective selling point, that she will pursue women's and children's issues with real vigor if she is elected. And she has highlighted throughout the campaign her commitment to the cause of women and children and their welfare and well-being. And she's highlighted that this is something that her career has been based upon. And it's very clear she's making this case out of her biography, right? And that makes sense in this type of race, this type of election. But she's also making this case, this commitment to women's and children's issues. She's making this case, and it's a case that conforms really to long-standing assumptions in American society about the role of women. That is, many, many Americans, men and women alike, right, assume that women serve as the chief, the foremost protectors of family and of children and of the next generation. That women may have many responsibilities, but this is probably at the top of the list. It's sort of a gendered assumption about how our society works. Some historians, some scholars sort of give it a name. They call it maternalism, right? Maternalism has a long history in this country, and it's a surprisingly strong history, right? It survives this notion of a special role for American women in society. It survives the 60s and the 70s. It comes out even stronger, perhaps, in the wake of the women's freedom movement. And my point here is merely, yes, we should see Clinton as breaking political gender barriers, but we should also see that in embracing this issue, this cause, embracing maternalism, she is embracing pre-existing, right, and very strong understandings of the proper gender roles in American life. She's embracing, in a way, a sort of gender conservatism, even as she breaks with other rules of how gender should play out in America. Now, the second case I'll make here on Clinton is about politics. It's about politics. I think Hillary Clinton falls very well in line with past Democrats. And that is, she falls in line with them ideologically. So here we need, and here's what I want to do, is sort of try to place Hillary Clinton's thinking and her ideology in the longer history of American liberalism. Okay? To understand this, you've got to understand that the Democratic Party, for decades, has housed both moderate and liberal wings, right? Now, in truth, those two wings of the Democratic Party share an awful lot in common. At the same time, the fights that break out between the two wings of the Democratic Party can get pretty brutal. And they happen pretty regularly. Okay? The party often breaks down into these moderate and liberal wings, and they fight. So here, think back, for those of us who are old enough, think back to, I'm not old enough for this one, Hubert Humphrey versus Robert Kennedy, right, in 1968. Right? Humphrey representing a more mainstream Democrat, Kennedy a more liberal wing of the party. Think, I was around for this one, Jackson versus Dukakis in 1988, right? Jackson representing the liberal left wing of the party, Dukakis representing much more of the mainstream technocratic liberalism of the 80s. And even when Democrats win the White House, right, they still battle. These two wings still battle because inevitably people from both wings end up in an administration. So we now know that the Clinton administration of the 90s, Bill Clinton's presidency, his White House was famously divided between liberals and moderates, okay? So in this respect, the drama of the spring, right, of Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton very much falls, I think, into a historical pattern that we see repeated almost over and over again, where more moderate liberals, moderate Democrats take on the liberal wing of the party and vice versa. Hillary Clinton, I think, can be understood as falling into this moderate wing of the Democratic Party. If you go through her positions, I think more often than not, you're impressed by that sort of centrist democratic impulse. So, for instance, she supports a progressive tax code. She actually wants to make the tax code more progressive. But she's promised to tweak the tax code to make it more progressive, rather than sort of a massive overhaul, right? She supports the welfare state. But again, here she's promised to sort of tweak healthcare coverage, to tweak anti-poverty policy, incrementally to expand the social safety net. That's a very moderate liberalism. She believes in government regulation of certain sectors of the economy, but she has not laid out an aggressive agenda on that front. Indeed, if you read the WikiLeaks speeches, supposed speeches that she gave to the financial sector, she really comes off as sort of a moderate liberal who wants to regulate Wall Street, but in certain particular fashions, right? In foreign policy, she's actually even less moderate. She's more to the right. She's a fairly hawkish interventionist Democrat, to the right of, I would argue, a lot of her party. Okay? And then there's this sort of temperament that emerges when you think about Mrs. Clinton. The way to put it is she believes in politics. She believes in politics. That is, she believes in the art of deal making. She believes in compromise. She believes in the art of policy making. She's not a crusader, right? She may talk like a crusader when she talks about women and children's issues, but when the rubber hits the road, I think what we've seen in her record is that she believes in incremental progress, incremental change. Now, much of this agenda, if I'm correct, explains the challenges, right, she had this spring, because the left in her party just can't quite warm to this approach. Okay? In the same way, right, that people who supported Jackson and Kennedy couldn't warm, right, to the liberalism of Humphrey and Dukakis. And in fact, she's placed in a particularly tough position here, because her own history hurts her as people try to assess where she lays in the long history of liberalism. Because the Clinton administration of the 1990s essentially adopted much of this moderate to conservative approach in politics, right? And so here she is being kind of, the left in her party, this is one of the reasons they're suspicious. It's not just her positions, but it's her history and her husband's history of being a moderate liberal, all right? Ultimately, I think what we see in Clinton is a mix of old and new, right? breaking barriers and then sort of conforming to certain trends in democratic politics. And she's a pretty moderate liberal by temperament, well within the mainstream of modern liberalism in the Democratic Party. Okay. If Clinton in some ways makes sense historically as a Democrat, Donald Trump presents a much more challenging case for the historian, right? It's a truism at this point to say, but it's worth saying, Trump is a candidate unlike any other we have ever seen before, at least in the 20th century. In the 20th century, presidential candidates in the major parties have possessed either military or political experience. Sometimes both. Sometimes both. Trump has neither. He is a businessman and an entertainer. The only other candidate in the 20th century whose resume, I think, bears a passing resemblance to Mr. Trump's resume is Wendell Willkie. Long forgotten Wendell Willkie, at least for most of us. Wendell Willkie was a corporate lawyer who was the Republican nominee for president in 1940. He actually was in utilities law. He switched his party allegiance in 1939 from the Democrats to the Republicans. And he manages to secure the Republican nomination and challenge Roosevelt. But he's really the only one who doesn't have this long history. And I will say in Mr. Willkie's defense, he was quite engaged in world issues. He was a guy who thought a lot about global issues in the late 1930s. And so in that sense, he's actually more in line with some of the other candidates that we've seen, right? All of this is a lead up to say, it's actually kind of hard to contextualize Mr. Trump within modern Republicans and the modern conservative politics. So let me talk a little bit about modern conservative politics, give you a little bit of an overview here, and you can begin to see where he might fit in, where he might not. So since the 1980s, the Republican Party has been the home of conservative politics in this country. And the Republican Party and its sort of conservative thinkers have stressed, I think, a few ideas as it built its electorally powerful coalition in the late 20th century and really came to dominate American politics. So, ideologically, right? Republicans and conservatives supported, generally, a strong interventionist foreign policy. Right? They supported trimming the welfare state and trimming government regulation of the economy. They supported free markets and lower taxes and free trade. And they supported what we might call a defense of traditional social or cultural values. To support this sort of ideological agenda, policy agenda, Republicans built a coalition. Unlike all great coalitions in American political history, the coalition was a bit fractious. So you had business interests, you had small government and free market advocates, you had social and religious traditionalists, you had foreign policy hawks, and you had, increasingly, as the 20th century comes to an end, white voters of modest economic means and maybe modest educational backgrounds. The genius, and I use that word purposefully, the genius of modern American conservatism was articulating this ideology in a really clear and concise fashion, and then assembling a coalition of voters to support the ideology, even when some elements of that ideological of that coalition weren't quite on board with all of the elements of the ideology. Right? So there were real tensions in this conservative coalition that was built over the last 40 years. Now, trying to place Mr. Trump in this longer history is where it gets challenging. It's a challenge because, to be honest, his positions shift over time, and sometimes quite quickly. And he actually readily admits this, right? He admits that his positions are, in fact, negotiable on certain issues. But it's also a challenge because he freely, at times, deviates from Republican orthodoxy, from conservative orthodoxy. And at times, he falls well within it. So an example of how Trump falls within Republican and conservative orthodoxy, his tax plan. His tax plan, for the most part, as we understand it, promises larger tax breaks for the upper brackets and for corporations, right? This is pretty standard conservative Republican thinking, right? And then at other times, Mr. Trump seems to defy Republican and conservative orthodoxy. He promises, for example, an American foreign policy, a rethinking of American foreign policy that pulls America back from engagement with the world, right? And he's promising, and this is what in some ways is shocking to many foreign policy experts, he's promising pulling back not just from areas that he deems sort of peripheral to American interests, but he's promising sort of a rethinking of how America engages with the center of Europe and the centers of power in Asia, which have been central to American security considerations since World War II, perhaps even before. And so in this sense, he does really break from what foreign policy thinkers in that party have advocated. And I do think that, you know, if you want to find somebody who mimics Trump in the Republican Party on this point, you actually have to go back probably about 60, 70 years into the 1940s, where the party had a group of folks who were much more suspicious of engagement with the world in the way that it came to be during the Cold War. Finally, on some issues, I think Trump adopts what I will call a sort of Republican conservative position. So on immigration, which I think is one of the things Mr. Trump has talked the most about, to be sure, Trump has claimed that he wants to deport non-legal immigrants and make it that much harder for immigrants to enter the United States. On this issue, actually, the modern Republican Party and the modern conservative movement is divided. Ronald Reagan and others like him argued in the 1980s for a relative open door to the United States and a free flow of newcomers. But at the same time Reagan was making that argument, other elements in the conservative movement, people like Patrick Buchanan, but also people who followed Buchanan, like these white voters of moderate means, made basically the same case that Trump makes today. Close the doors, make it harder to get in, and impose some sort of litmus test on who can come into the country. On immigration, then, Trump is he's splitting the party, right? He's picking a side, rather, in a fight that's been going on among conservatives and Republicans for a couple of decades that has never been resolved. And he's chosen one side of that fight. Now, the last point that I've made here on immigration, I think actually is important, and it's revealing in some larger ways, because it shows how Mr. Trump is bringing to the forefront ideas and conflicts that have been submerged in the conservative coalition and in the Republican Party for a number of years. Okay? And let me make this point with two examples. And there are two examples that are particularly part of the public conversation right now, because these are controversial positions, very controversial positions. So we have heard a lot recently about from Mr. Trump about the possibility of a rigged, that's the term he uses, a stolen election. I would just urge us to recall that elements in the Republican Party have been making a similar case, warning of the dangers of a rigged or stolen election, for the past decade. Okay? Elements in the Republican Party have launched efforts at the state level to toughen voter identification standards, to make it to make the process by which one can cast their ballot harder. Okay? The claim is, these Republicans at the state level are making the claim that voter fraud is rampant. Okay? And therefore these measures are required. I think what Trump is doing is picking up on this same claim that has become, part of the Republican Party's political strategy at some states, in some states. Second, Trump has at times used what can be called racially insensitive language, or offered up what some perceive as racialized code words designed to stoke fears among white voters. So for example, Trump speaks fairly regularly, he did the convention of law and order. Trump has denigrated, right, the Black Lives Matters movement. And most famously, right, Trump has engaged in birtherism. All of which reveal, I would say, questionable racial politics here, right? And he's engaging in some pretty what I think some have called, racist gambits. My point is that this is not unfamiliar for the modern Republican Party. Okay? Richard Nixon, when he was running in 1968, trumpeted law and order. That was no pun intended. I mean, he used the term law and order repeatedly, right? Calling to mind visions of black civil disorder in black neighborhoods, right? In an attempt to appeal to working class white voters. In 1980, Ronald Reagan launched his campaign for the presidency in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Those of us who are old enough or study the history enough will know Neshoba County because it's the place where 3 civil rights workers were murdered in the early 1960s. And Reagan goes to Neshoba County to kick off his campaign for the presidency, and he gives a rousing speech where he talks about his respect for states' rights, right? Which was, if we all recall, the calling card, right, of segregationists. Okay? And so here, Reagan is trying to court the white South using these racialized code words. In 1988, George H.W. Bush ran the infamous Willie Horton campaign ad, which played up white fears of black criminality. Right? And what I'm trying to get at here is that Trump's appeals to sort of white insecurity, white fears, and even white nationalism have historical echoes. To be very clear, Trump's rhetoric is louder, I think, than what we've seen in the past on this front. It's delivered on a more prominent stage than what we have seen in the past. And it's delivered in a new media, I'm almost done, good. It's delivered in a new media environment, right, where his words bounce around the internet quicker than we can keep track of them. But these ideas have also been a part of the GOP playbook for a number of decades, okay? So it's shocking rhetoric, but I would contend not entirely unsurprising. Now, all of these policy positions, and the campaign rhetoric that Mr. Trump has offered up has had one final effect. It's made very real, very clear, the fissures and divides in the GOP coalition. Trump is playing to certain aspects of that coalition, certain elements. Whites of modest means, religious and social conservatives. And then he's attacking other parts of that coalition. I think we could go so far as to say that he is actually in the process of kind of fomenting a civil war within the Republican Party. To be fair, I think, he's not the cause of the civil war in the Republican Party. This fight in the party has been going on for a long time, okay? And it came in particularly sharp relief after 2008, okay? But Trump is sort of adding real fuel to this fire in the party, this fight in the party. And so one of the questions moving forward is what happens to the Republican Party after this election? Win or lose. Win or lose. There are historical precedents here for parties falling apart in American life. I would only say the Republican Party has been on the verge of collapse twice before in the 20th century. 1912, when the progressives bolted. 1964, when Barry Goldwater led a very conservative presidential campaign. And the Republican Party is still here today after both. So, in 10, 20, 30 years, when I'm teaching your children or your grandchildren, for some of you my older friends, right? It would not surprise me one bit if I'm talking about the demise of the Republican Party, and equally, it would not surprise me one bit if I'm talking about how they reformulated and bounced back. We're just going to have to wait and see on that front. So, thank you very much for your time and attention, and let's have a conversation. So I'll just call on. Hi.
Hi. Regarding Hillary Clinton, I wonder if it could be argued that her, is it motherism? Is that
maternalism?
Maternalism,
yeah.
And her emphasis upon the family could be strategic on her part, precisely because she is a woman in a country that has historically been hostile to women in positions of power. And looking at her history, one thing I don't understand is why people are so quick to consider the presidency of Bill Clinton to represent Hillary Clinton, because after all, she was First Lady. But even as First Lady, she made a very dramatic shift in her position after the backlash against her leadership on health care and the baking cookies comment. And that, I mean, she really changed in the second term. And I wonder if, given that, the comments that you made, which I found very interesting regarding Clinton, could be seen as part of very strategic political moves on her part.
So it's a great question. I think you're probably right. There's no question that there's a strategic rationale behind the sort of embrace of and the sort of framing of herself, right, as a woman children's candidate. Part of that has to do with the way modern American politics sets up, and frankly, votes break down along gender lines. So one of the things that's happened in the last sort of 30 odd years or so, 30 or 40 years, is a stark gender divide between the parties. Okay? It doesn't really exist prior to 1980, but you start to see it in 1980, where women tend to trend more to vote more Democratic, and men tend to vote more Republican, right? And it really emerges in 1984. Actually, the Reagan campaign gets very nervous about the fact that they're so far down in the polling with women. And the gender divide has remained there between the two parties. Okay, and I think, to your point, I do think some of this is strategic, right? She knows that one of her paths to victory is to bring out female voters, and so therefore stressing issues that she thinks, and she's probably tested this polling wise, right? They all test everything. This is a gambit to get her those votes. And frankly, she also pretty smartly says, well, I think I can make myself a sharper contrast than with my opponent, right? And now we know, for instance, right? We seem to know that the one person the Democratic Party wanted to run against in this campaign was apparently Donald Trump, because they felt they could draw these contrasts and energize their coalition in ways that maybe other candidates they couldn't. So I'm agreeing with you that some of it is strategic, to be sure. The second issue you raise is a really great one too, because it gets to this question of what can we learn about Hillary Clinton's first stay in the White House that helps us understand what's going to happen in her second stay in the White House, right? And the one area that I know actually really well from teaching it is the healthcare episode. And I think there we see a lot of her strengths as a politician, as somebody who is eager to engage the policymaking process and think through difficult issues, right? We also see somebody who has a hard time, frankly, managing the policy process. Okay, if you go through and you read some of the material that we now have from the archives, it's very clear that that process was not streamlined, and that she and her advisors had a difficult time running it. Okay, and so in that sense, I think that's the episode that I take away from this, where I think, well, maybe this informs how she will be president. But I actually get nervous when we try to do this exercise, because I think there's a lot that we don't know about how that White House worked and her role within it. And so I think it's actually really hard to make these judgments. And to be honest, I have a colleague a graduate student at another university who's writing on welfare reform right now, and she's been in the Clinton archives down in Arkansas and is uncovering all this stuff. And that's a way of saying us historians are still piecing together the story. So it's sort of episodic what we have right now to make these judgment calls. Way in the back.
Related to that topic about Hillary discussing, do you think that their focus on domestic policy for women's issues, family issues, is something that's purposefully or a strong advocacy platform?
Well, so I think it is done purposefully. I also think, look, it can be done for multiple reasons, right? Candidates embrace issues for strategic reasons because they know this will get the vote out, right? Or this will get my coalition going. But they also embrace issues because these are things they believe in. So in this case, I actually think it's both. I think she believes in these issues, right? And she also is doing it strategically. I'm merely trying to point out that she's in embracing this set of issues, right? She is in some ways playing. It's a safer issue for her to do because of her biography, and in some ways because of her gender, is that it gives her a little more freedom to do that. And I think it'll be interesting to see how much she pushes on this front. When the time comes, if she's elected, does she push really hard here? And how does she think about, and this is going to be the fascinating thing, right? How does she reconfigure the American social safety net to encompass these other concerns in a more substantive fashion? Because her argument right now is that, yes, the social safety net deals with women and children, but not in the best ways possible, and not strong. It's not strong enough to help those who need help. And so she's really promising to reconfigure that, right? To rethink it a bit. And it'll be fascinating to see how she can do that, whether she can do that. Now, and we all know what the next point should be, right? She's going to have to deal with a Congress. And so she may have her plans, and then she's going to have to deal with sort of getting stuff through Congress. And so there's going to be some give and take here in her thinking, even on this issue, which I think she's going to make pretty central.
So you talked about the fractious nature of the Republican Party now, and how win or lose after this election, the Republican Party may have to do some serious change, or perhaps it may even collapse. But do you see any underpinnings or cues of that in the Democratic Party at this time as well?
That's a great question. So, I mean, it's sort of an interesting thought exercise, right? That if Mrs. Clinton loses the election, does it lead to a rethinking, right? And okay, so the first thing to think about here is that, of course, after every election, and this year, I guarantee you, as soon as a winner is declared on November 8th, and we all can click off our TVs for the first time in months, right? As soon as that happens, the blame game will begin, right? And one side is going to say, here's what we did right, here's why we won. And the other side is going to say, here's why we lost, and it's not my fault, it's that guy's fault or that gal's fault, right? I mean, this is what's going to happen. So what I'm saying here, right, is that this is normal in American politics, right? Is the winners try to diagnose why they won, the losers fight it out over why they lost. It would happen in the Democratic Party, to be sure, if Mrs. Clinton loses, right? I tend to think that the divides in the Democratic Party are a little less severe. They agree on a little bit more, maybe even a lot more in some instances, than the divides in the Republican Party at this moment. Okay, and so for that reason, I would, you're asking a historian to predict the future, but I would just sort of ask you, as you think about what happens afterward, think about, are those fracture points as defined, right? And also keep in mind, right? It's a great question because you're really focusing on the point that modern American politics is built upon coalitions. It's actually building of coalitions, of voters and ideas and things like that. And you have to figure out how to manage these coalitions and manage these ideas. And that, if one thing we know about politics is, that's really hard to do. Whether you're a conservative or a liberal, or Republican or Democrat, that is a real challenge. It takes real talent to do that. And so I think both parties will face challenges after this election of maintaining that coalition and sort of putting together this sort of grouping of ideas. But I think the Republican Party, win or lose, is still going to be in a more precarious position. It just seems that way from what we've seen so far.
If the Republican Party does fracture and lose power, can we see maybe a third party gain power, maybe become part of the two-party system instead of Republican?
That's a possibility. If I knew the answer to that, I'd be in Vegas right now and putting my money down in the political betting market, and then I would retire. I don't think I have enough money to bet so that I could retire. But yeah, so historically, again, and maybe this returns to sort of the point I ended with. At times in American political history, we have seen this fracturing. So in the 1850s, way long ago, there was a party called the Whig Party, right? And it falls apart on over multiple issues, a lot dealing with slavery. It falls apart in the 1850s, and out of it, there's sort of a weird transitional period where there's all these other little parties popping up, like the Know-Nothings, right? They're around for an election or two, and then all of a sudden, out of the Midwest and the Northeast comes this Republican Party, Party of Lincoln, right? And it's birthed largely out of the ashes of the Whig Party, the ashes of the Know-Nothing Party. I mean, it's sort of this motley group, right? And so we have examples of this happening in the past. So sure, that's a possibility. That is very much, it wouldn't, I mean, it could happen. But I think it's just as likely that somehow the sort of collective forces in the Republican Party managed to sort of glue it back together again. But I would ask yourself, I was talking about this with a friend the other day, and I just said, you know, as this fight goes on in the Republican Party, as these fissures become more clear and more sharp, it actually, to my mind at least, I'm having a harder time envisioning how you put Humpty Dumpty together again. I'm not quite sure how that happens. Suffice to say, it has happened in the past, right? So again, I think both possibilities are open. Both possibilities are open. Oh.
It's interesting. The Republican Party, in its inception, seemed to be most successful because the South seceded, and they were able to pass legislation that, in some ways, we're still fighting about, which was civil rights after the Civil War. I wonder. I mean, so I look at the politics and say, gee, you know, we're still fighting the Civil War in some fashion with the way the South seems to still have. I mean, states' rights is still an issue for them, and it's an issue in the campaign, as you were pointing out, in a kind of underground way. So, like, maybe they'll secede again.
Well, again, not going to predict the future. I think, look, I mean, what you're getting at is, I mean, this is why when both candidates, Mr. Trump and Mrs. Clinton, say this election matters, I mean, they're right. I mean, all elections matter, though. I mean, we should be very clear about that. All elections matter. This one, because it seems to get at some very central sort of qualities or notions about what the American experience should be, sort of what should society look like. And here you're thinking about what's the proper role of the federal government versus the states, right? Who should be allowed to come into the United States and perhaps become a citizen, right? What should that national community look like? All of these are issues that we do that come up fairly regularly, right, in American politics. Sometimes more than others. Okay? I mean, I would argue that, you know, the 2000 election, which was pretty contentious and you know, a razor-thin margin, right? It didn't maybe have, I don't remember it having, the stakes weren't outlined in the ways that they were outlined today. They were there, but they weren't as energetically presented, perhaps, right? So all this is a long way of saying, I don't think we're refighting the Civil War, and I don't think we're going to see secession again. But those questions of what is the country, like who are we as Americans? There's a reason why I teach a class at this university called, you know, who are we? A history. Like, I actually do that. But that's why, because we are, as Americans, constantly re-arguing these basic issues. And we all agree, at some level, we believe in democracy, we believe in equality, we believe in opportunity. We all believe in that, but we invest different things in it, given our backgrounds, our histories, our politics, and all that. And that's what's happening in this election. I would just say, it seems to me that the volume is even louder this time around. And I think that has a lot to do with the media environment. I think it has a lot to do with the candidates, right? On both sides, who we have. And that has changed the dynamics a little bit. But at some level, it's a very much something we've seen in the past.
experiencing is this perpetual war in the Middle East, perpetual war at home, and nothing really ever seems to really improve. And I just feel that they're, you know, with like, even with like the issue about this, Putin having and meddling with the elections, you know, people on the left really think that's a dangerous thing to be airing and having no proof about. But my biggest concern is just, you know, after the elections, it's going to be World War III. People at home are going to go over there and have to fight wars. And these wars that keep continuing are going to drain our budget and our economy. We're going to be so decadent because all we're going to see on TV is this violence, as if we don't even have enough of that already. So I just really am very pessimistic about the whole situation.
I think you're not alone. I mean, I think there are people who are frustrated with the state of political discourse in this country and the inability at some level to sort of talk seriously about issues. And I think this election has given people reason to be pessimistic about that. Now, I would say, if you think historically about this, one of the things that's happened in the last 20 to 30 years in American politics, I'm always going to bring it back to history, is polarization, right? So the two parties in our system have become polarized, meaning they've become ideologically homogenous, right? And they have become, in some ways, sometimes almost regionally based parties. But so that there's not an overlap where you might have some conservative Democrats talking to some liberal Republicans and vice versa, right? And so with this polarization, I think one of the effects of it, right, is that serious conversation about issues that that do need to be dealt with, sometimes don't get dealt with in a fashion at all. Instead, because in a polarized political environment, how do you win an election? You don't appeal to the middle, you appeal to your base. And so you talk to your base. And when you talk to your base in modern American politics, it usually means you talk very loudly and with a lot of energy and without a lot of specifics. You get them riled up. Right? And that's what's happening. And so it's led to this sort of, I think any long-term observer of American politics is kind of really frightened by the level of discourse and the level of specificity in the policy proposals. Like, it's just not there right now. Now, I don't want to make this seem like if you go back 100 years, everything was the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? And highfalutin, right, policy proposals flashing back and forth, things like that. There was a lot of craziness back then too, and rhetoric and all that. But I think there was probably more of this sort of concentration on issues and sort of focusing on problems the country faces. And so I think part of this is the history of polarization in our country, political polarization, which is really the last 20 to 30 years we've seen it. Do we have time for one more? Yeah. One more.
Yeah, I was kind of like that with that, like, Mark Van Buren kind of like created like this idea of using kind of the parties as, a way to bring the elites and like people together and like kind of their voices more heard. But like, it seems like now it's kind of almost like it's an A or B option. It's picking less than two equals, and it's like, are really people, getting, like, are these parties really serving the people, or are they kind of just going with their own kind of agenda, and they're always like conflict? I don't know.
No, I mean, what you're getting at is you're getting at a frustration that I think many Americans have with the way political parties work and the way the party system functions, right? And I think that frustration is very real. And I would add that I think one of the changes in the last, again, 30 to 40 years is money in politics, right? money has become, it was always important in politics, okay? Money matters in politics. In the 1840s, you were buying kegs of cider, the good kind of cider, right, for your supporters to get them out, get them excited to go vote, right? You're spending money on that, right? But nowadays, money is, there's so much money in politics. It is the tidal wave that has overrun American politics. And actually, if you listen to politicians, many of them feel like they feel the frustration too. Like they feel like they've made a deal with the devil, that the only way they can play in the game is by going out and raising all this money. And there's these arcane rules about how you raise money, and this is on both sides, Republicans and Democrats. A lot of them are just, it makes them very, very frustrated because they don't feel like they can represent their constituents, and they don't feel like their parties are doing anything besides raising money. And that's probably not good for American politics. If American politics becomes who can raise the most, the fastest, I'm not sure that that's the best thing, but that's the world we live in.